Gosh. Well, all right, where are we? Last time we were talking about speaker meaning, and I want to continue with that and, in fact, finish it today. Now, remember, the way the course is organized, in the first part of the course, I present you an account of how I think the philosophy of language ought to be done. If our question is, how does language relate to reality? How do words stand for objects and states of affairs in the world? The shorter answer is that it works because human beings do it intentionally. So the way to analyze meaning is to analyze the intentions of speakers. Now you might say, yeah, but what about sentences? Sentences have a meaning even if nobody ever utters them, and that's right, they do. But it's best to think of sentence meaning. The sentence is kind of a frozen speech act. You can haul the sentence out of your pocket and give it to somebody, and then it's actually functioning as a speech act. But it's best to think of the conventions of a language as conventions for using the language, as conventions for using words to form sentences and sentences to perform speech acts. At any rate, so I'm going to argue. Now that has not been the dominant tradition. The dominant tradition sees language as essentially a formal structure, and we'll start on that today. I'll get to that approach to language today. I'm going to finish the speech act or intentionalistic discussion today, or try to. And then at the end of the course, we'll go back and discuss a series of specific problems, like the nature of metaphor, or the use of language to perform indirect speech acts. I've mentioned those in passing, but we ought to have a more elaborate theory than I've given you so far. We ought to examine other forms of representation, such as pictorial representation. What kind of a speech act is a picture, for example? We have to discuss certain puzzle cases, such as fiction. There are sentences that occur in a work of fiction that are exactly the same as sentences that occur in nonfiction. So what's happening? Somehow the rules don't apply. If the guy writes a book and says, once upon a time there was a little girl named Little Red Riding Hood and she wore a red riding hood, it won't do to ask him, well, how do you know there was such a girl? Or how do you know that her hood was red? Maybe it just looked red in those lighting conditions. We know in some sense, we know that, well, in a work of fiction, the normal rules are suspended. So I need to explain all that. But in any case, today I'm going to finish talking about speaker meaning and start talking about Frege, who invented this subject. Let's go with speaker meaning. I began last time by giving you a brief, very bare bones or sketchy analysis of what it is to say something and mean it as an assertive, a directive, a commissive, or what have you. And I had so much success with my performative handout, I decided to make a handout about this. I'm embarrassed to do that because it doesn't sound so bad when I say it, but it always looks kind of dumb when I write it on a sheet of paper. But anyway, I guess that's a problem that everybody has. Anyway, I want you to go through this with me. Here's our problem. We want to get from the speech, from the sound to the meaning. You didn't get one. You should have talked to one of the GSIs. They would have helped you out. Here you go. Have one. Yeah. How do you get from sound to meaning? How do you get from the physics to the semantics? So I imagine that this guy is making physical gestures. He's waving his arms, but he could be uttering sentences. The important thing is there has to be a physical act of some kind, and I abbreviate that as bodily movement, BM. So the BM there stands for bodily movement. So if for the speaker to say something and mean it as an assertive, he means the enemy is present in my example of the guy who's signaling from the top of the hill. It means it as an assertive that the enemy is present if and only if, and that's kind of over grand, because I'm sure we can get fussy kinds of counterexamples. Yeah? Just to make sure, the guy who's waving his arms, those are utterances. Yes, That is an utterance. If we say, now Bill, I'm going to go to the top of the hill, and when I get up there, if I wave both arms, that means the place is crawling with enemies. Okay, then waving the arms is a speech act. It's an utterance. You don't have to open your mouth to make an utterance. You don't even have to use conventional words and sentences. You can use gestures or grunts or nods of the head. There are all kinds of ways, ingenious ways that human beings have of performing speech acts, of which the most common is speech, is actual utterance of words and sentences. But in the case I'm imagining, we're making it very general. The guy makes a bodily movement with a certain intention. Okay, what is the intention? The intention, and this is an intention in action, and since it's self-reflexive, we know that it's got to function causally. The intention causes the bodily movement. I raise my hands, and that intention caused the bodily movement. But now, and this is the key to meaning, I am imposing conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction. The movement of the arm was a condition of satisfaction of the intention to move the arms. But now the secret of meaning is that those conditions of satisfaction now have conditions of satisfaction. So this intention action has to cause the bodily movement. The bodily movement itself has conditions of satisfaction, that P, that the enemy is present, and it has that with the word-to-word direction of fit. That is, the utterance is supposed to represent how things actually are in the world, and not, for example, it's not an order to you to bring the enemy here, or an order to somebody else, a promise to myself, a promise that I'm going to do something. Okay, so the intention and action cause the bodily movement. The bodily movement has COS is not because I can't spell, but it's abbreviation for conditions of satisfaction. With the word-to-world direction of fit, that P. And now we got to communicate all this. I've got to intend that the hearer recognizes the bodily movement. He actually sees this bodily movement, and he recognizes that it has these conditions of satisfaction. Now that is the sort of the bare nugget of performing a speech act. Different sorts of animals can do that. The bees famously do it. What do the animals lack? Well, we'll get to that. But one thing they lack is this elaborate internal syntax that human languages have. And that is an enormously powerful device. And indeed, that's one of the conditions that enables us to create human civilization, to create money and property and government and marriage and universities and all the rest of it. Okay, but right now we're just getting what it is to perform an act and intended as a speech act. That's assertives. Now we go to directives. Remember, the definition of a directive is you're trying to get the hearer to do something. The definition of the directive illocutionary point is that it counts as an attempt by the speaker to get the hearer to do something, even if the speaker doesn't give a damn, even if he doesn't care, or he hopes that the order is disobeyed. All the same, when you give an order, that counts as an attempt to get somebody to do something. Did you try to get him to do it? Well, I didn't give a damn if he did it. Yes, but you issued an order, and if you issued an order, then that counts as an attempt to try to get somebody attempt to get somebody to do something. So here, I raise the right arm. That means you guys have to advance on the enemy. It's an order. S performs a bodily movement and means a directive to the hearer if and only if, again, this intention and action cause the bodily movement. And this time, the bodily movement has condition of satisfaction with the word-to-word direction of fit that H does A. H is supposed to make his behavior change to match the content of the speech act. And now you get this self-reflexive feature of orders. You only really obey the order if you do the thing you're ordered to do because you were ordered to do it. And that's another way of saying that H does A because the bodily movement has those conditions of satisfaction, because it was intended as an order. Now, of course, you can have all kinds of other reasons for obeying the order, but at least the existence of the order itself, if you're fully obeying the order in the full sense, that has to function as at least one of the reasons. So I oversimplify that by saying because the bodily movement has those conditions of satisfaction. And then we get communication. The hearer is intended to recognize the bodily movement, and that the bodily movement has those conditions of satisfaction. Notice all of that is still inside the scope of the intention and action. What are you trying to do? I'm trying to give this guy an order. And do you intend that he recognize it as an order? Yes, of course, that's what it is to intend to communicate. The order is to intend the utterance as an order and to intend that the hearer recognize it as such. Okay, I'll keep going through this and then we'll stop for questions. So we got through statements and orders, or assertives and directives. Let's go to promises, commissives. I raise my right arm if I order you to attack the enemy. I raise my left arm if I promise that my buddies and I will attack the enemy. So S performs a bodily movement and means it as a commissive that the speaker will do act A, if and only if, and then same bodily movement. This intention action causes the bodily movement. And the bodily movement has condition of satisfaction with the word-to-word direction of fit that S does A, that the speaker does A, and that he does it because he's made a promise. That is because the bodily movement has those conditions of satisfaction. And then again, the communication intention, the hearer's got to recognize all that stuff. Otherwise, you don't succeed in communicate. And since the utterance is an attempt to communicate, then the speaker has to intend that the hearer recognize the bodily movement and that the bodily movement has those conditions of satisfaction. Okay, now that's the guts, but now we got these two extra cases. One is the expressive, where you make a gesture just by way of apologizing. It's very interesting to observe drivers and how they try to communicate with each other. People are perfectly polite in ordinary sidewalk encounters, become absolute monsters once they get behind the wheel of a car. And part of the problem is there's no convenient way to apologize if you inadvertently cut in front of the guy. He's honking his horn at you and shaking his fist, and you'd like to say you're sorry, but you can't. So you make a gesture that suggests, well, gee, I'm kind of sorry I did that, but it never works. Once I thought, well, the thing to do is to shoot myself in the head, so I did like that. You see, that was misunderstood. It got exactly the opposite effect. He just honked his horn louder. Anyway, cars ought to come equipped with a sign that flashes up, said, sorry about that, or something like that. It ought to be a comfortable way for people to apologize, thank, and so on. I thank somebody for letting them in. We do this waving of the arms, but it's a very crude speech act. Anyway, if you watch drivers, you'll find that they are linguistically impaired. They can't communicate very much. Honking the horn and waving your arms are very poor devices. But anyway, let's imagine that somebody does want to express an apology, wants to express sorrow or regret for something he has done. It seems to me he performs the act, waving his arm, let's say, and means it as an expressive of a state E of regret for having cut the guy off and driven him into the ditch or the sidewalk. That is, you express regret for that, presupposing the truth of the proposition. It's not, you don't have either of the standard directions of fit. Well, okay, the intention action has to cause the bodily movement, and the bodily movement just is supposed to be an expression. Now, it seems weird here that you got the same word inside the analysis as you have in the analysandum, the thing to be analyzed. But I don't see a way out of that. I think expressives are kind of the most primitive form of speech act because you don't have any extra layer of conditions of satisfaction. You just intend that the utterance should be an expression of regret or sorrow or whatever it is. Whereas in the case of the order, it's more than an expression of a desire. And in the case of the statement, it's more than an expression of a belief. There are people who try to analyze statements as just expressions of belief. I can't imagine how they thought they could get away with that. They both got A's in this course many years ago, but anyway, you can look at their book. Their names are Kent Bach and Mike Harnish, and they're both terrific philosophers. As I told you, they got an A, and each of them at different times got an A in philosophy, 133, and they went on to write famous books about speech acts, refuting me up one side and down the other. And I have to tell you, I think their effort to analyze assertions as just expressions of a belief, that won't do, because the whole point about the assertion is it's more than just an expression of a belief. It has to commit you in certain ways. An assertion that it's raining is more than just saying, well, I believe it's raining, or I got a hunch it's raining. No, a flat assertion commits you, and they cannot. They don't explain the notion of commitment. And well, I better explain it to you, but I will. Let me go through this first, and then I'll talk about the special features of commitment. Another thing where you can look at, they wrote various books on speech acts, and I recommend them. I mean, they're good books to read. It's just that I disagree with them at certain crucial points. Another thing is they don't have an adequate analysis of performatives. They say, well, a performative just is a statement. You say the meeting is adjourned, and that's just a statement. And then, since everybody assumes statements are true, because one of Grice's rules of conversation is you're only supposed to say things that are true, well, you got to ask what makes it true. Well, it makes it true that the meeting is adjourned, that you said the meeting is adjourned. Now, that seems to me not enough. If I could make a performative by making any statement whatever, then I could make myself king of Spain by saying, I'm king of Spain. And of course, then I would be king of Spain, because on the rule that you only make true statements, I would have made a true statement, and what could make it true other than I'm saying it? See, the problem with performatives is how it is that I can adjourn the meeting, or pronounce somebody husband and wife, or order you to leave the room just by saying it, but as I said last time, I can't fix the roof, start the car, or fry an egg with a performative. Let the egg be fried. I hereby fry the egg. I mean, even in German, it doesn't work. German sounds more authoritative, but even, you shout at the Eier as much as you like, it's still not gekocht. Okay, so this is just a footnote by way of suggesting that you can't oversimplify the analysis too much. All right, so far so good. We seem to be moving smoothly, but now we get to these damn declarations. And I'm not quite sure how to do that, but here's how I did it for this analysis. The point about that declaration is that it's got both directions of fit at once. Because when you adjourn the meeting by saying the meeting is adjourned, or in this case we imagine the guy, it's a particularly noisy group, so they have a rule that when the chairman raises his or her right hand, that adjourns the meeting. The meeting is adjourned. Okay. So S performs the bodily movement and means it as a declaration that the meeting is adjourned, if and only if, well, okay, this is an intention and action causally movement. And the bodily movement has conditions of satisfaction with the word-to-word direction of fit. It's going to make it the case that the meeting is adjourned, but that state of affairs, making it the case that the meeting is adjourned, that the meeting is adjourned, that state of affairs is caused by the fact that I represent the meeting as adjourned. That is, that the bodily movement has conditions of satisfaction with the word-to-world direction of fit that the meeting is adjourned. The secret of declarations is you make something the case by representing it as being the case. And you might think, well, that's kind of an oddball thing to do. But the fact is, that's the single device by which we create the distinctive features of human civilization. You are a citizen of the United States. Barack Obama is president. You're a student in this university. I'm a professor. We're in the middle of the term. Very soon we're going to have, well, not soon enough, but very soon we're going to have Christmas vacation. And all of those things are created by declaration. Now, often it's not explicit. Often you have just treating something as something. You treat Sally as the boss, and that makes her the boss. But treating her in that way is a case of representing her as the boss. And representing her as the boss, if that is accepted by enough people, and it is embedded in the social situation in the right way, then it makes it the case that she is the boss. So you have this double direction of fit. You have the peculiar direction of fit that goes with declarations, where you achieve this direction of fit. You change reality to match the propositional content, but you do it by representing reality as having been changed. That's all of the money in your pocket, for example, is created by that type of representation. Now, it needn't be an explicit speech act. I go in the bar, and everybody sits down, and I go up to the bar and order 3 beers. I know that Sally likes a really heavy crap, so I get her a Guinness. I know that Betty likes that dreadful stuff that they make in St. Louis, so I can't even say that name. I was once in a bar in Chicago, and a guy ordered this beer, and it's not real beer. They make it with rice. They admit on the bottle it's made with rice. True, the Japanese make beer with rice, but they don't have a choice. They can't grow the right kind of stuff. Well, okay, now I'm not strong on morals, but I have one moral principle. Avoid bar fights. So I didn't tell the guy that why are we talking about beer? Anyway, let's back to speech acts. I go to the bar and I get 3 glasses of beer and I bring them back to the table. I push one in Sally's direction. I say, this one's yours. I push one in Mary Ann's direction. I say, this one's yours. And the third one, I say, this one's mine. Those are declarations. They create rights. If Sally tries to drink Mary Ann's beer, Mary Ann has a legitimate complaint. So I want you to see, this isn't something that only happens in courts of law. It happens every day. You're constantly performing declarations to create a system of rights, duties, obligations, etc. And that's, I claim, in another course besides this one and other books besides the ones you've been reading, I claim that is the key to understanding human civilization, is the creation of rights, duties, obligations, and other forms of powers, what I call deontic powers. We create those by performing declarations, explicitly or implicitly. They need not be done by an explicit performative or even an explicit speech act. In the case of Sally and Mary Ann, I might just push Sally's beer in her direction and Mary Ann's beer in her direction. That is a speech act. Pushing the beer in that direction can constitute a speech act. Just as if you're not very well brought up, you can get something at the dinner table just by pointing at it. Okay, so here, that's the declaration, and again, I have to intend that the hearer recognize the bodily movement and that the bodily movement is intended as a declaration. Now, those of you who remember our great discussion of Gricean counterexamples will know we have to add something to this, and that is, in order to avoid the caveman sort of counterexample, the hearer's got to understand not only that the bodily movement has these conditions of satisfaction, but that he's intended to recognize that. That is, that there's not only do I intend that it has these conditions of satisfaction, and he recognized that it has these conditions of satisfaction, but he is intended to know that he is intended to recognize it. You get this second level there. Okay, now that's the bare bones analysis of the different kinds of speech acts that are possible in language. Now then, what happens as language evolves is you get conventional means of doing these, and most importantly, you get conventional ways of breaking up the sentence into parts which you can then shuffle around at will. And there's nothing like that in animal communication. It's true the bees have a kind of internal syntax, so different features of the waggle dance will indicate how far away the nectar is and what direction it is. That's sort of a glimmer of syntactical structure, but it's nothing like human syntax. Gilbert, my great laboratory of doggy wisdom, Gilbert can believe that somebody's at the door, and he can let me know that he believes somebody's at the door by barking, for example, or by going to the door and barking. But he can't believe that maybe somebody will come to the door next week. And he can't wish that 1,000 people would come to the door. And he can't wish that the door would go to somebody. His capacity for representation is severely limited by his perception and his memory. He can't do what humans can do, and it is shuffle around syntactical elements at will. And that is an enormous power that we have. And I'll say more about that when we jump inside the proposition. You see, so far, most of what we've been doing is out on the outside of the propositional content. In this great formula, we've been out here. And that's kind of fun out there because there's no huge, long tradition going back to Aristotle. You see, one of the things that's fun about speech acts is, at least when I first got into it, you don't have to worry about what the great philosophers of the past thought about apologizing, thanking, and congratulating. I don't know if Aristotle and Aquinas even had a theory of apologizing, thanking, and congratulating. Assume the great philosophers start with Plato. I mean, Socrates never published, so we don't know what he actually thought. But assume they start with Plato, and they certainly go through Kant. I don't know if there's been any great philosophers after Kant. But the beauty of speech acts is you don't have to give a damn about those guys because none of them wrote about speech acts. Now it's got kind of the subject's gotten messier as it's gotten bigger. But the proposition, everybody's been writing about what goes on in here since Aristotle, at least. So out here, you're in a forest full of flowers. Here, this is the battlefield of the Somme. It's full of the dead carcasses of philosophical theories and all of the damage to the landscape that comes from philosophical artillery. Anyway, we're going to get inside the proposition in a very few minutes. Okay, so that's our bare bones analysis of the possibilities of meaning. Now, I said there were 5 conditions of adequacy that our analysis had to meet, and I now need to go through those and explain them to you. But let's take questions. Let's stop for questions about what I've said so far. Everybody's up with us. You understand the stuff on the sheet. It's essentially the same as in intentionality. Yes?
You said it was a caveman counterexample?
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, you obviously missed the lecture in which I discussed it. That's Strawson's counterexample to Grice. You remember the 2 cavemen, one is in the tree looking at the guy, and I'm the guy arranging lion tracks to communicate to the guy up the tree that there'd been a lion messing around his cave, but I don't want him to know that that's what I'm doing, but I do satisfy Grice's conditions in that case. I intend to produce an effect by getting him to recognize my intention to produce that effect, but I don't intend that he should recognize that the effect is intended to be produced by means of his recognition of my intention to produce it. And for that reason, how the hell did I get on lecturing on this one again? But anyway, if you go get onto they record all this stuff and you can get a recording, or better still, do the reading assignments and you'll find all this discussed there. That was Strawson's famous counterexample to Grice, and that made it look as if we needed a 4th intention in addition to the original 3, and that 4th intention looked like it might produce an infinite regress. So that's when I tried to cut the whole thing short by saying, let's distinguish meaning from communication, or, to be more careful, within the theory of meaning, let's distinguish the representation in a certain illocutionary mode. Let's distinguish that from the communication of the representation from the speaker to the hearer. So if this is the representation, the propositional content in a certain illocutionary mode, then the speaker creates that, and then he communicates that to the hearer. Now in this sheet, all of the lines except the last line are about the creation of this. The last line, the hearer recognized the bodily movement and that the bodily movement has those conditions of satisfaction. That's about communication. So this is the representation and this is the communication. Okay, so our first condition of adequacy. Well, let's go through it. Other questions? I want to make sure I've answered that everybody understands the handout sheet. Okay. Our first condition of adequacy is you got to show how to get from the physics to the semantics. After all, when you get down to it, in order to talk, You got to do something. You've got to flap your jaw or wave your arm or make marks on paper and so on. And it's a remarkable thing about human beings. It is a sort of miracle of evolution that we have this throat apparatus that enables us to produce all kinds of utterances, strictly speaking, a potentially infinite number of different utterances just by wiggling our jaw, our mouth, and our tongues. And indeed, in some languages, I wish I knew how to speak them, they do various clicking noises and various snorting sounds that sound more or less sordid to us, but that's because we're not speakers of the language. I had two Dutch friends once, well, they were actually South Africans, and they were on a train in Holland, and there was an attractive girl in the seat in front of them, and they thought, well, she's not going to understand Zulu, so they started talking about her in Zulu, which involves a lot of clicking and humphing noises. And then when the train stopped, she got around and made a rude remark to them in perfect Zulu. But anyhow, so this is the problem of assuming other people can't speak your language. Yeah, and this is very common. And you're getting foreign situations where people assume you can't speak German or something like that. All right, so now we're going to go through and consider how this meets our condition of adequacy. The first one was you've got to get from the physics to the semantics. We've done that. The second one is how do you get the two levels of intentionality, the intention to produce an utterance and the intention that the utterance should be meaningful. The intentionality in producing the sounds and the intentionality that the sound should be meaningful, that it should be a speech act. We've captured that as well, because in each case we have that the intention is not just that that a sound or other bodily movement should occur, but that the bodily movement should be meaningful, and that means it has condition of satisfaction. That's what I was driving at when I used this slogan. I hope it's not misleading to say the key to understanding meaning is it is the intentional imposition of conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction. Okay, but now then comes the hard part. How do you get these complex relations? And specifically, how is it the case that the condition of satisfaction for successfully performing the speech act are not the same as the condition of satisfaction of the speech act itself? You can successfully state that it's raining, even if you got it wrong, even if it isn't raining. So the condition of satisfaction of the statement have to be different from the condition of satisfaction of the making of the statement, even though the intentionality in the making of the statement has to determine the condition of satisfaction of the statement. Is that clear? You understand that? You got that? I mean, that's kind of. I think that kind of stuff's fun. I mean, I like to do this kind of analysis, and it is a bit complicated, but I think it's pretty clear how it's supposed to work. Let me just finish the sentence, then we'll take questions. Here's how it works. You intended to raise your arm. You intended that raising your arm was a statement, which is to say you intended that it had conditions of satisfaction. But you can succeed in raising your arm and in making the statement. You can succeed in raising your arm with those conditions of satisfaction, even if this condition of satisfaction aren't satisfied, as even if what you say is false. So the intention to make a statement has to determine what counts as a true statement, but you can succeed in making a statement even if the statement you make isn't true. Furthermore, this is what makes lying possible. Lying is only possible because you can intend to make a statement and succeed in making a statement even in cases where the statement isn't true and in cases where you know it isn't true. So one of the things we might say that's remarkable about human beings is they can lie. And I don't know if it's possible to lie in other languages. Can the bee lie about how far away the flowers are? I doubt it. I mean, I think her poor a bee-ish brain may not be up to that, and it may be that the capacities of the bee language don't allow for lying. Now, her sisters can refuse to believe her. There's a famous experiment where they took a barge full of flowers and carted it out in the middle of the lake. So the bee comes out and sniffs these flowers. God, that lake's full of flowers. So she goes back to the hive and tells her it's the girls talking to girls here, and tells her girlfriends, there's a hell of a lot of nectar over in that direction. And they, in the middle of the lake, forget it. They don't pay any attention to her. They do not believe that there really that this stuff is in the middle of the lake. So they don't go dashing out to the middle of the lake. Now, I'm not sure I believe this, but anyway, this is published. You can find this. It's a published report. And the idea is that you can have a case where the bee communicates something that the other bees don't believe because they have reason for supposing it can't be right. They don't think flowers can be in the middle of a lake. All right, but the remarkable thing about human beings, and this is this third condition of adequacy I'm trying to capture right now, is the intention to make a statement determines what counts as a true statement, but the intention to make a statement is different from the intention to make a true statement. And you can succeed in making a statement even if the statement isn't true. And that is that's where the intentionality behind meaning differs from other sorts of complex intentionality. When you intend to pull the gun, intend to fire the gun by pulling the trigger, you do have a complex intention. Pulling of the trigger causes the firing of the gun, but you don't have this possibility for insincerity. You don't have this possibility for deliberate misrepresentation or for failure in the achievement of the representational intentional content, because there isn't any in the case of firing the gun by means of pulling the trigger. The special feature of linguistic meaning is that you get a propositional content inside the propositional content of your original intentionality. So you intend to produce a bodily movement where the bodily movement now itself has a propositional content. And all of that is in addition to the propositional content of the intention, even though the propositional content of the intention has to determine the propositional content of the speech act and has to determine what counts as succeeding in the achievement of the propositional content of the speech act. It has to determine what a true statement is, even though the intention to make a statement is not the same intention as the intention to make a true statement. Now, if I can get you to understand all that, you'll understand more than most people who do the philosophy of language, even professionally, or so I am inclined to say. Okay, oh yeah, somebody, you had a question, yeah.
Kind of a terrible question, but how about imposing conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction?
You can do that too, yeah. I'm too sleepy at this time of day to think of a good example, but that would be a case where you took a statement, which was a statement, and then added a speech act on top of that statement. I haven't thought about it, but let me think about it. I'll report back next time. Let me think about it now. You take a statement, I intend to go. See, I'm inclined to think this is what extremely sophisticated novelists attempt to do, is that they impose conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction. When you get into some of the more obscure passages in Nabokov, or my unfavorite, Henry James, you may be getting something like that. But let me see if I can think of an example. Or maybe here's an assignment for you. You think of an example. You track down an example. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
Another question about shuffling syntax. Okay, I seen in an anthropology video.
Yeah.
About studying about chimpanzees learning sign language.
Yeah.
And one thing that blew away the anthropologists is when they asked them, and there was many other examples of this. They asked them about a duck, and they said, what is that? And the monkey knew the sign of duck, but didn't show the sign of duck. It showed the sign for water, and it showed the sign for bird.
Yeah.
So it created its own thing. So
it created something.
Example of shuffling syntax?
It's something like that. I mean, I don't know this example, but it sounds like an example whereby there's a compositional element in the duckish vocabulary because it says it's a water bird. Yeah, that's interesting. Give me the reference to that. I'll track it down. Well, you don't have to do it now, but after class.
There's other ones too, like for instance, watermelon. It
Yeah.
said candy and said like something sweet. And
Yeah.
like,
No, you do get a kind of compositionality, but it's nothing like, and as I said, you do definitely get compositionality in the B language, but it's nothing like what you can do in human languages, where anybody who knows the language can move representations around at will. You can make an indefinite number of new sentences you never heard before, where you understand the meaning perfectly, even though it's something you've never heard before and will never hear again. Okay, other questions about about this, because I'm now going to go through these other conditions of satisfaction. Okay, we got through the first three of our conditions of adequacy, that we got to show how to get from the physics to the semantics, that we've got to show the double level of intentionality in the performance of the speech act, and we got to show the complex relations between three intentionalities: the intention to perform the speech act, the intention to make the bodily movement, and the intentional content of the speech act itself. Now our fourth one, I'm not sure this is the same order in which I present them. The fourth one was that you got to have a clear distinction between representation and communication, and I think we have that because on the handout sheet, the last line under each heading gives you the communication intention. It's the intention that the hearer should recognize the representation, that the hearer should recognize the meaning intention, or if that seems to be begging the question against Grice, that the hearer should recognize the representation intention. Okay, but our fifth condition of adequacy is the one that might seem the toughest, and that is, how do you show that these are the only possibilities? How do you show that the categories, the five possible kinds of speech acts, are the only possibilities of language? And here I think the answer has to come from the direction of fit. And the direction of fit is itself grounded in the human cognitive apparatus and the fact that we've got a sensory nervous system and a motor nervous system. We've got a nervous system that has this direction of fit, where you're supposed to get representations here that represent the reality down there, and it has that direction of fit where you're supposed to change the reality to match the representation. And there are only so many things you can do with that. You can do this one, which is the assertive, this one, which is either the commissive or the directive, but you need, I think, a hearer-based class of speech acts. Those are directives like orders and commands. And you need a speaker-based class, promises, vows, and pledges. Why? Because of the character of the deontology in question. Remember, deontology is the Greek word meaning duty, and I use it generally for duty, obligation, rights, responsibilities, and all the rest of it. And in the case of representation, I can't create an obligation in my hearer just by giving him a directive. If I say to you, give me $5, you're under no obligation to give me the $5. If I say to you, I promise to give you $5, then I am under an obligation. So I think you need both a hearer-based and a speaker-based. Then you have these cases where you don't actually try to achieve a fit, but you just presuppose the fit. And I use this rather lame PRP, or I put presup on the handout sheet. And that's where you just presuppose the fit, as when you say, I apologize for stepping on your face, or I thank you for giving me the money, or all these other things that you can do. And those are important classes of speech acts. It's interesting how it matters so much to people whether or not there was an apology. Did they apologize for what they did? It's very important to the Chinese that the Japanese should apologize. Well, fine, I'm all for speech acts. Okay, but now then you got this one. And this one is, it looks like it's caught off to the side. That's where you got the double direction of fit, where you make something in the case as representing it as, by representing as being the case. And I made a very strong claim, namely that that is the device in all of its complexity by which we create human civilization. And it has these remarkable formal properties. You can apply it over and over and over. And the stuff you create with it then interlocks in other ways with all sorts of other things. So, to take an example, I open this hole in my face and the noises come out. But now, they count as statements or assertions or explanations or promises. But a certain kind of a promise in a certain sort of circumstance will count as undertaking a legal contract. But undertaking a certain kind of contract counts as getting married. Now you see what happens. We keep piling one on top of another. And then in the state of California, when you get married, all sorts of declarations come into play. You now have spousal benefits, you got income tax deductions, you have special pension rights in the university, and it seems crazy to me, but males now get special pregnancy leave and all this sort of thing. I have one male colleague had a difficult pregnancy and had to take off when his second child was born. And so you get all these rights that you wouldn't otherwise have, and all of those are created by declaration. So this apparatus iterates upwards more or less indefinitely. All right, so what I'm arguing is that the possibilities of meaning are created by the possibilities of human intentionality. And human intentionality allows effectively these two basic ones, and then it allows just pure expressions where you take the truth for granted, and then it allows you to combine those two into this one. And then I think it's worthwhile having a variation on this uphill direction of fit, so you have one hearer-based and one speaker-based. Anyway, that's the justification of the categories. It can't just be an accident that there are these 5 ways of performing speech acts that has to be determined by the nature of the human mind and by the nature of meaning itself. Now, there are a whole lot of other hard questions that I haven't answered, and that is, why sentences? Why is it that every language has sentences? And what's the big deal about the sentence? And the answer is that the sentence is the unit of the intentional state. You've got to have a whole sentence to capture the intentional state, because you've got to have whole conditions of satisfaction. You need the conditions of satisfaction. And the entire condition of satisfaction will give you an entire proposition, and the sentence is the device for expressing the proposition. Remembering, of course, that in a sentence you've got to have both a device for expressing the proposition and a device for the illocutionary force. You have to have the indicative or declarative word order as opposed to the interrogative and the imperative. And you have a certain kind of intonation contour and a certain sorts of stress, and all of those will indicate illocutionary force. Okay, so let's stop for questions about this. Now, it's clear that if we take this seriously as the right way to go about it, then when we get in here, when we get into this old battlefield here, the proposition, intentionality is going to loom largely. So, to take a simple example, don't think that the word Socrates by itself just stands for the guy. Rather, it is the fact that conventionally people use it to perform a speech act of referring. They refer with the word Socrates, but referring is something done not by words but by speakers in the use of words. You can say that the word Socrates refers to Socrates, but that's short for people use it to perform the speech act of referring to Socrates. And what kind of a speech act is referring? Well, we're going to get to that in some detail. Okay, how are we doing now? Questions about all this? Because now we're going to leave the subject of speech acts, and we're going to take a deep breath. We're going to start doing mainstream philosophy of language, beginning with the works of Gottlob Frege. By any last questions about speech acts? I sort of dread Well, why not? Frege's wonderful. Let's face Frege more cheerfully. Yes?
You said you were going to give us a definition of an illocutionary act.
Yeah, an illocutionary act is anything like this stuff on this sheet, anything that satisfies those conditions.
So is it just anything that's not performative or perlocutionary kind of?
No, well, it can't be perlocutionary, remember, because the illocutionary act is defined by the intentions of the speaker, whereas the perlocutionary act is defined by the further effects on the hearer. And this is why, as we've seen, you can't have a performative verb for the perlocutionary effect. We can have hereby state and I hereby argue, but we cannot have I hereby convince you or I hereby persuade you. See, the hereby is important in the performative because it means by this here very utterance I make it the case that. That's why it's always a declaration. But you cannot create perlocutionary effects by declaration. You can't persuade people, convince them, annoy them, amuse them just by saying that that's what you're doing. It's up to them. There's some further effect that has to be achieved. And this is why we can't have a performative verb for insult. I hereby insult you. Notice there is a locution in English. You can say things like, you can't insult me, meaning you're not in a position where you can achieve the perlocutionary effect on me. But we don't have an equivalent thing for you can't make a statement to me. Maybe that means you shouldn't make a statement, or I wish you didn't make a statement, but you can make a statement even though the statement doesn't succeed in persuading me, convincing me, or insulting me, because those are all perlocutionary. Yes?
So an illocutionary act can have a perlocutionary effect.
Indeed. Now let's go through this. It's very important. Typically, the purpose of having language is to achieve perlocutionary effects. You make statements to people because you want to persuade them, or you want to convince them, or you want to get them to do something about it. That's the characteristic purpose of the illocutionary act, is to produce further effects on hearers. But you can't do that just by convention. So what you conventionalize is the illocutionary analog of the perlocutionary effect. So you can't convince people or persuade people, but you can make a statement and thereby inform them. They may not have been convinced by the information. They didn't believe it, but you did succeed in stating and informing. So if you're looking at the evolution of language, it seems to me it's good to see the different types of illocutionary acts as serving the purpose of producing perlocutionary effects. But meaning and convention won't guarantee the achievement of the perlocutionary effect. So we have an illocutionary analog, which is what you can do by the stuff that I put on the sheet of paper, whereby you inform people, you make a statement, you make a promise. The purpose of promises is normally to create stable expectations, but you can't do that with a speech act by itself. You cannot have a performative, I hereby create in you the stable expectation that I will come to your house on Wednesday, but you can say, I promise to come to your house on Wednesday, and the purpose of having that institution is to create stable expectations. I must have told you about Pritchard, who's one of my favorite authors on this subject. Pritchard was an Oxford philosopher, I guess around the 1920s. He flourished, and he was obsessed about promising. How can saying these words create an obligation? Well, that's the question I'm trying to answer, but he didn't get an answer to that, and he finally got so obsessed about the awesome, the sheer magnitude of promising, he couldn't do it. So if you asked him, will you come to my party, Pritchard would say, I fully intend to come to your party, but he wouldn't say anything that could be construed as a promise. He couldn't bring himself to promise because the metaphysical burden of promising was more than he could bear or understand. So he would say, I fully intend to come to your party, or I fully intend to pay you the money I owe you. And this, I mean, that I like that, because that's a guy who takes speech acts seriously. Okay, other questions. These are good questions. Okay, Gottlob Frege. Now, if this were a conventional course in the philosophy line, we would begin with this. This would be my notes on Frege, and I would say Gottlob Frege was a professor of mathematics at the University of Jena, and if I'd done my homework, I'd be able to tell you when he was born and when he died. He lived quite long. He died in about 1925, and in his very old age, he started announcing right-wing political opinions. These are an embarrassment to Germans today, because Frege is the greatest German philosopher in the... Well, we're counting Wittgenstein as Austrian for these purposes, but Frege is the greatest German analytic philosopher after Kant. And Frege was obsessed with the nature of mathematics, particularly arithmetic. And Frege thought it is a scandal that nobody knows what a number is. What is a number? And Frege gives a definition of number, which I'll get to. But in order to develop a philosophy of mathematics, Frege had to reinvent logic, and he did. The logic that you study in a logic course in this or any university is essentially Frege's invention. Frege invented what is now known as the predicate calculus, or sometimes called quantificational logic, or first-order quantificational logic. It's all Frege's invention. And it is much more powerful than the traditional Aristotelian logic. Now, it's very interesting what happened intellectually. Intellectually, after Aristotle, logic didn't make any progress for over 2,000 years. And that's an amazing fact. I mean, the medievals worked very hard on the theory of the syllogism, and they cleaned it up. They made it much more precise than what is in the original Aristotelian text. But basically, they were filling in the details in Aristotle's story. And Kant could say that logic is essentially finished. It is a finished subject. There's nothing more to be done to it. And as far as Aristotelian logic is concerned, I think that was mostly right. There have been efforts to make it more formalized than Aristotle had it, but essentially the Aristotelian theory of the syllogism is complete. Frege's logic is much more powerful. Frege invented quantificational logic, and there are just all kinds of things that you can do with quantificational logic that you can't do with traditional Aristotelian logic. For example, the notion of the scope of an expression in the sentence is something that Frege makes quite clear in a way that the Aristotelian can't quite do it. So for Frege's logic, there's a clear distinction, let's say, between the sentence, every boy loves some girl, and some girl is loved by every boy. Now, both of those are ambiguous, but the passive tends to sort out the ambiguity, because every boy loves some girl would say, for each boy, there's some girl such that the boy loves the girl. But some girl is loved by every boy says there's one girl who's very popular, right? I mean, and Frege has a way of making that precise. Now, the notation that we now use was not invented by Frege. Frege invented a very fancy notation called a concept writing, and I've never learned it. People who've learned it just love it. I've never learned it. But in any case, the one that you're familiar with is the one with these backwards E's and these upside down A's. Now, the sentence that says every boy loves some girl says for all x, boy x implies there is some y such that girl y, it's not short for girly, but anyway, y is a girl, and X loves Y. Now let's see, I'm no good at brackets, so let me see if I got this right. For all X, boy X implies there's some Y such that girl Y and X loves Y, and you need another bracket there. But the other one, there is some girl is loved by every boy. It looks completely different. That looks like this. There is some Y such that girl Y, and for all X, boy X implies X loves Y. Now notice what we've got here is a difference in scope, because in this one, the existential quantifier, there is some Y, has within its scope there is an X for all X, boy X implies X loves Y. Now let me see if I wrote these right. This one says there is some Y such that Y is a girl, and every boy loves that girl. That is, for all X, boy X implies X loves Y. This one says all the guys in the class, all the boys have a girlfriend. Every boy loves some girl. For all X, boy X implies there's some Y such that girl Y and X loves Y. I think that's right. Okay, now the point is that may not look like a big deal, but there are literally an indefinite number of these formulae that Frege can capture that cannot be captured in traditional logic. And people tell me that this is absolutely essential for modern technology, that you can't do the theory of computation and you can't do computers without the predicate calculus. And this is Frege's invention. And the logic that you learn effectively in any place now in the United States teaches Frege's logic as opposed to traditional Aristotelian logic. All right, but now, in order to do the philosophy of mathematics, Frege had to reinvent logic. But in order to reinvent logic, he had to invent the philosophy of language as a separate subject. And I'm not sure he really cared all that much about this, but he did invent the philosophy of language. And the interesting thing today is that his philosophy of language is still very influential, whereas I think his philosophy of mathematics, his analysis of number, and his definition of number have now been superseded. There's now all sorts of other things that go on in the philosophy of mathematics, even though in its modern form, Frege invented it. Okay. What is it then about his philosophy of language? Well, let's go through it. The single most important feature of Frege's philosophy of language is his distinction within the sentence between the sense and the reference of expressions. And the original German is Sinn, which translates sense, versus Bedeutung. Now, in literal German, Bedeutung means meaning. So this would be a distinction between sense and meaning. But in a lot of the contexts where Frege is talking about this, he uses this as equivalent to reference. And sometimes he says, I remember reading Frege in German, where he says, bedeuten oder benennen oder bezeichnen. And all of those mean something like refer, naming or designating or referring. And he gave famous illustrations of the distinction. He says, and incidentally, this is another thing you should notice, is that this style of philosophy proceeds by puzzles. You have a puzzle and you try to solve the puzzle. Here was Frege's puzzle. How can an identity statement of the form A is identical with B convey any information? Because if A is identical with B, it looks like you're not saying anything different from A is identical with itself. How is A is identical with B any different in its cognitive value, in its cognitive content, from a trivial statement of the form A equals A? But Frege says there is an important difference between A equals A and A equals B, and that enables information to be conveyed by A equals B in a way it is not conveyed by A equals A. And that is, the sense of the two expressions may be different, even though the reference is the same. And he gave a famous example that's used over and over. And it's this. For a long time, the Babylonian astronomers knew that there was a star which they called the evening star, and they knew there was a star that they called the morning star. It was a great discovery that the evening star is identical with the morning star. It wasn't a trivial truth of definition. So the evening star is identical with the morning star, contains an informational content which is not present in the evening star is identical with the evening star. I mean, it's kind of an obvious point. Now, how should we characterize this informational content? Frege says, in addition to the sign and its referent, we need to add a third element, its sense, or as I would put it in the ordinary use of English, its meaning in the ordinary use of meaning. So the expression evening star means something different from the expression morning star, even though they both refer to the same thing. When I tell you Barack Obama is the President of the United States, both of those expressions, the President of the United States and Barack Obama, refer to the same guy, but the second conveys, the sentence I uttered conveys an information not conveyed in Barack Obama is Barack Obama, or the President of the United States is the President of the United States, because the sense of the expressions is different. Now, what about this sense? What does that do for us? What is the what is it about the sense of the expression that enables it to convey information? And Frege's answer to that is the sense of the expression provides the mode of presentation of the reference of the expression. And the German, for those of you who like German, it's the Art des Gegebenseins, the mode of presentation. A sense gives you the mode of presentation by which the sign refers to the referent. So you have three elements in your theory of meaning: sign, sense, and reference. You have sign, Sinn, and Bedeutung. And the sign refers to the Bedeutung. It refers to the reference because the sign gives you the mode of presentation, the Art des Gegebenseins. Now, Frege was good at metaphors, and he says you got to think it's as if you shine a light on the reference. You shine a light on the evening star, and you shine a light on the morning star, and it turns out, though these are two different lights coming from two different directions, they're both flashlight beams shining at the same object. The object, says Frege, is as it were einseitig beleuchtet. I like speaking German because you can shout and holler and sound like you're a German officer. It's einseitig beleuchtet by the Art des Gegebenseins. And einseitig beleuchtet means it's illuminated from one side. It's, as it were, illuminated from one side. Okay, so now this solves our puzzle. Our puzzle was, how can the identity statement be informative? And the answer is because though they have the same referent, they have different sense, and that means this one is an important astronomical discovery. This one is a trivial logical truth. Now, immediately you have a problem. Well, what about proper names? In the case that we just considered, the evening star is identical with the morning star. Well, actually, the Babylonian astronomers had proper names. I don't know enough Babylonian astronomy to know if this is accurate, but anyway, it's in all the philosophy textbooks, so it's probably inaccurate. But anyhow, here's how it goes. That one of these stars they call Hesperus, and the other one they called phosphorus. And guess what? They discovered that Hesperus is identical with phosphorus, that they are one and the same star. And so Hesperus is phosphorus, has the same informative content as the evening star is the morning star, because the proper name just is identical with the description. And now those descriptions, the evening star and the morning star, meaning the star that shines in the evening at certain times of the year in certain parts of the earth, and the star that shines in the morning at certain times of the year at certain parts of the earth, those are called definite descriptions, because a definite description in English is any noun phrase beginning with the word the, and in the singular, such as the President of the United States, the Queen of England. All of those are definite descriptions. So Frege's initial claim about proper names is that every proper name is simply identical in meaning with a definite description. Well, what do you do about the fact that different people sometimes associate different descriptions with the same proper name? Somebody might not know that Barack Obama is the President of the United States, and he still wants to use the word Barack Obama to refer to that guy. Well, says Frege, this is an imperfection of ordinary languages, and that is that you can have different meanings, different senses attaching to the same name. And he says, strictly speaking, people who don't attach the same sense to the name Barack Obama are speaking a different language. To that extent, they're not speaking the same language that the rest of us are speaking, because though they use the same words with the same reference, it has a different sense. Okay, so far so good. It sounds like we're making progress, though it does seem a bit fishy to say that every proper name is really equivalent in meaning to a definite description. But then Frege made some other moves with his distinction between sense and reference, which seem more puzzling. If you take the whole proposition, the whole Satz, the whole sentence, Socrates is bald, well, Frege tells you this expression here refers to this guy, okay? And it does it in virtue of the fact that it has a sense, and that sense determines a reference. How about this half of the sentence? Does that also have a sense and a reference? Now, I'm going to say, no, it has a sense but not a reference. The function of this half is quite different from the function of this half. But Frege didn't say that. What he said is, this also has a sense and a reference. But strictly speaking, it isn't just is bald, but it's what you have if you knock out the proper name and you have blank. So that part, the blank is bald, that has a sense and a reference, and that refers to a concept, what he calls in German a Begriff. But now, if you're going to say, well, okay, there's something that stands to the predicate part of the sentence in the way that the object stands to the subject part of the sentence, you got a problem, and that is, why can't you substitute names and refer to the same thing? So suppose I'm going to say, well, is bald refers to baldness, let's say, then, or even the concept bald, then it looks like we ought to be able to substitute these for the original X is bald and put Socrates baldness, or Socrates the concept bald, and then you broke down the sentence. Now you don't have a sentence anymore. You start off with a sentence, Socrates is bald. You say, just as the expression here, Socrates, refers to the guy, so the expression here refers to a concept. And that naturally question will be, yeah, which concept does it refer to? And it seemed like the answer ought to be, well, the concept baldness. But if that were right, then you ought to be able to substitute the expression that this refers, you ought to be able to substitute any expression that refers to the same thing that this refers to in the original sentence. But you don't. You get a breakdown If you say Socrates, the concept baldness, you no longer have a sentence, you've just got a list. So what's going on? Well, I think any other philosopher would have said, well, we shouldn't say is bald refers. It doesn't work the same way that the proper name works. But one of the marks of a great philosopher is that what looks like an absurdity, they declare it to be a discovery. And Frege declared, no, I've made a great discovery. Namely, there's a special feature about concepts, and that is you can't refer to them with nouns. They come, that's why, because the noun can only name something that's complete, whereas the concept is incomplete. It's unsaturated, ungesättigt. I love Frege's German. But anyhow, okay, I'm going to tell you all about that next Tuesday. So it's not so bad talking about Frege. We got into Frege today.